발표해 주시겠습니다.
Yeah, thank you. 델러리, not 딜러리. Well, I'm delighted to be invited, whatever my name is, and I apologize for having such poor Korean that I will speak in English. But I think this is a very important conference. That's why I was very happy to be invited to participate. And I appreciate the frankness of the title, that there's a new government. I sort of like that. But I think what is so important right now is that for Korea, but it's important beyond just Korea, that this kind of discussion is happening with different sorts of voices, because realistically, we know what we just got with the new president, Moon-jae-in. We know he has a fundamentally different idea about inter-Korean relations, and so that's kind of a political fact. But there's also a danger that lessons are not learned, and advocates of engagement, and many are in this room, but some are here are critics, but the advocates of engagement have spent most of the last 10 years criticizing the lack of engagement, and in their minds and in their statements defending the sunshine policy, and criticizing mostly a sanctions and pressure approach. So now a very rapid transition is necessary, and I think this discussion is part of that transition of a very practical self-reflection on the part of those who think that engagement should play a much bigger role in the approach to North Korea, to figure out the lessons learned of the first decade, and then to apply those going forward and change the strategy and adapt the strategy. You know, a sunshine policy is from Aesop's fable, of course. And many in the American discussion are now using Heraclitus against Aesop to say, oh, you can't step in the same river twice. It's all different now. It's not going to work. You shouldn't even try. But I checked some Heraclitus the other night. He also says, the sun is new every day. And even better, he says, if there were no sun, it would be night. So in that spirit, I think we need to think about what has changed and how to adapt. And I think this bill is really quite fascinating as a way to adapt. It's an adaptation, and it is an example of learning from the limits of the first experiment going forward. I think the way that we got here as well with the candlelight, the lessons of the candlelight movement are very important. Because, to me anyway, one of the big lessons of that was the importance of autonomous civil society in South Korea, in what makes South Korea a dynamic and strong country and good country. And this bill that we're talking about, especially the parts of it where I see something really important, are where the National Assembly, at least in this group that's backing the bill, is looking for ways to strengthen the autonomy of civil society actors, who of course played a critical role as sort of the ground troops in the first decade of engaging North Korea. So I think that's very important. I was asked to focus on Professor Kim's paper, but I can't help in listening to the discussion note the really interesting differences in approach between Professor Che and Professor Kim Tae-gyun. And I think that is, we don't have to choose one or the other. I think that I would point that out as another very positive example of, again, adapting and learning and finding new ways to refresh the approach to inter-Korean dialogue cooperation. Because where Professor Che really emphasized, I would describe it as a non-Korean, as a very Korean way of looking at it. That's not a criticism, with emphasizing the Koreanness. and talking about the very concept of brotherly love. Obviously, South Koreans are the only people in the world who can talk about North Korea and use the term brotherly love, and that's a meaningful phrase to South Koreans. That is not the way the rest of the world can even begin to think about North Korea. So that's very important. South Korea brings something very different to this problem, to this question, than anyone else in the world. And I thought Professor Che captured that really well in his remarks and in his thinking. But I was just as struck, and there's just as much to learn from Professor Kim Tae-gyun, who, as he said, I'm not a North Korea expert, and he's really bringing all kinds of international insights and expertise. And critically, you could say it's kind of cookie cutter, but it's not. These are best practices from at the UN level of international work on problems where there are similarities to North Korea. And I think there was less of that in the first round of cooperation. And so I think it's critically important that in the new era to synthesize the insights that we've heard. And it starts with this kind of dialogue where you hear both of them side by side, but going forward, I think that synthesis is going to be critically important, where both sort of international best practices, treating DPRK as just any other country out there, treating inter-Korean relations as just two countries' relations, which is basically the premise of Dr. Kim's paper and presentation, where that is an important part of the mix, and yet so is the Koreanness and the concept of brotherly love and the thinking behind Professor Che. So I don't think we have to choose between the two of them, but I think it's very important that find ways to integrate them. One of the things I'm also thinking about in these papers and presentations is the question of humanitarian assistance and development cooperation. And I think that it's artful and well done in the draft bill, where the two are just included together in a phrase. But also, as we think about them, they're different categories, and they lead down, they can be complementary, but in the case of DPRK, there are some problems. And I think it's worth seeing those problems up front and recognizing that those are going to be problems. Humanitarian assistance is, hard to argue with humanitarian assistance. But actually, from my perspective, my criticism would be it's not ambitious enough. It is too conservative, for lack of a better word, not politically conservative, to just say we should be allowed to engage in humanitarian assistance with DPRK. Because I don't think that is a strategy that will allow South Korea to play the kind of transformative role that it can play in engaging North Korea. If it's grounded only in a kind of humanitarian assistance clause, that these are hungry people in crisis, I don't think that basis is strong enough for what South Korean civil society should want to do and can do, and which, if it does, will have very positive, constructive, long-term impacts on the problem. So I note that, and a second part of that goes back to this, the Heraclitus, that you can't do the same thing twice. I think there's a difference in terms of how DPRK will see a humanitarian assistance initiative versus how they will see a development cooperation initiative. Humanitarian assistance sounds to me like the old way. It sounds like, oh, the poor North Koreans, they're hungry, they're starving, they were in a famine in the 90s, they're barely out of it, they need us, they need our help, we're the rich South Koreans who can help them. That, to me, of course, that's never something that works very well with North Korea, but I think it especially does not work well under Kim Jong-un's North Korea. And so again, there are limitations to relying on humanitarian assistance as the paradigm for what you're trying to do, because I think it limits the kind of appeal, the kind of traction. In a sense, you could say it limits DPRK's ability to engage with you. Because if your mindset is, okay, we're back, we're coming back to help you again, that doesn't work very well in terms of what Kim Jong-un is trying to do, whether you like it or not. He's trying to do two things. He's trying to develop an ironclad nuclear deterrent, which none of us like, especially Americans, and he's trying to develop the economy, which we should all learn to like. And the trick in dealing with Kim Jong-un, in my view, is to limit one and augment two. But you can't augment two, his desire for the economic development of his country, if you just focus narrowly on humanitarian assistance. So again, looking at the bill, I think it's in there in the bill. But in some of the discussion, I think there's too much, in my view, too much emphasis on humanitarian assistance and not quite enough on development. I'm cognizant of time, so let me just say a couple things about the questions that Professor Kim ended with. A really interesting set of questions and the slide on those sort of future tasks, I think he called them. And one he raised is how to locate Korean NGOs in cooperation with the UN strategic framework and with sort of broader international community. And so I don't have the answer to that either, but I would just emphasize the importance of that question, and this is more to the NGO community here and who hosted this, co-hosted it, that and actually it goes back to this point about Koreanness versus broader international dimension. I think that in the whatever's to come in the new era, I think that probably a lot more work could be done by those civil society groups who lead the effort, who think that there's a better way to handle North Korea in terms of their engagement, the kind of horizontal engagement with other actors in the United States, in the EU. I mean, if you look here as an American based in Seoul for 7 years, so much of the sort of meetings, conferences, thinking about the role of engagement with DPRK is hosted by Europeans, not by Americans, including this. So there's a lesson in that Korean NGOs should, and already do, but should really, again, in a new era, without a lot of time to lose, really look at those relationships and see what can be done to develop those relationships. But there are some American NGOs, and I probably work with all of them because it's a small group, but who philosophically support this kind of effort. But again, they don't know much about the kind of local Korean NGOs who are doing this kind of work and would be doing this work going forward. So I just think that Professor Kim's point is really critical there, and it's not just a theoretical point, it's a very programmatic point about making those connections. And there are difficulties, but anyway, I just wanted to stress that. For the National Assembly, similarly, with interparliamentary and intercongressional engagement, I think is critically important. You know, as Professor Che mentioned, over the last 10 years, there's been a fairly coordinated effort at building up legal barriers to the kind of work that we're talking about. In the US Congress, and this has been going on very recently, it's going on actively now, and at the UN level. And there is now a role, and that's really fundamentally what we're talking about with this bill, for a legal effort which really only South Korea and only this National Assembly can lead. A kind of legal defense of engagement and dialogue and cooperation. And so that begins with understanding the legal barriers that have been built up and also talking with those who have built those barriers. Because there are points of, it's not a sort of zero sum. There are points of overlap where those here, especially in the civil society arena, who have a different philosophy of what can be done in inter-Korean relations can find ways to agree with the kind of sanctions hawks in the United States, for example, who are mostly interested in ways of cutting off funding to the nuclear and missile weapons program. You can seek ways to sanction and cut off funding to those programs in the context of robust engagement with North Korea, the government and the people. And that should be what we're all working toward. Not everyone can agree to that, but a lot of people can agree to that. But it will require, just like NGOs need to talk, it will require National Assembly members, they probably all left by now, but it requires them to talk with their American counterparts, and again with their European counterparts in EU Parliament, and globally at the UN level to coordinate that. So I think I'm probably, am I out of time? Should I stop? Yeah, all right. I'll just make one last comment, which is, again, in those questions, the future task questions that Professor Kim left with, which was about unification. And I'd actually like to hear him expand a little bit more on it, especially given his orientation from a kind of UN perspective and international best practices perspective. But I think unification, somewhat like humanitarian assistance, it's a very, it's kind of a double-edged sword. So unification is an emotional and a political driver behind this effort. It's also a way to be inclusive in a South Korean context. You can build a bigger coalition among both liberals and conservatives in South Korea when you talk about unification, because it's a goal that is shared among many, despite, even though they would disagree on a bunch of other things. They could, at some very, even if it's an emotional level, agree maybe on unification. And also internationally, unification and the discourse of unification gives South Korea this sort of special role. It's a claim. Of course, it also has legal implications. There's a legal claim of sovereignty, explicit in unification discourse, that then it's part of the legal defense effort, because South Korea can say, and the National Assembly can say, well, really, according to our law, it's our territory. So our law, sorry, US Congress, would trump your law because it's our sovereign territory. So this unification on many different levels, but again, one thing that needs to be factored in is how unification discourse, just like humanitarian assistance, can be part of a patronizing attitude toward North Korea, which again will limit it could place limits on the degree of engagement. And so that's something to be factored in, but I'd be curious if Professor Kim had any more thoughts about the question he himself proposed at the end of his presentation. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 델러리 교수님, 토론이 아니라 발표를 부탁드릴 걸 그랬습니다. 김태균 교수님하고 최철현 교수님의 그 발표 내용을 좀 대비시키면서 국제주의적 접근, 그리고 한국식 접근이라고 말씀을 하셨지만 그 표현은 좀 어폐가 있을 것 같고, 한국적 상황, 그러니까 배경 역사를 갖고 있는 접근으로 대비시켜 주시면서 우리가 곰곰이 생각해 봐야 할 많은 점을 말씀해 주셨습니다. 특히 그 촛불 집회를 언급하시면서 앞으로 신정부 아래서는 시민사회가 큰 역할을 할 것이다라고 이제 좀 격려를 해주셨고, 또 한편으로는 헤라클레이토스의 말을 인용을 하면서 같은 강물에 두 번 빠지진 않는다. 우리는 옛날에 학교 다닐 때 헤라클레이토스 말을 만물은 유전한다 이렇게 배웠죠. 어쨌든 상황이 지금 우리가 2007년으로 돌아가 있는 게 아니라 2017년이라는 상황에 있어서 오늘 토론을 하는 것을 다시 한번 일깨워 주셨습니다. 감사드립니다.